One. Hi, I'm Jillian.
And I'm Abby.
And welcome back. I'm keeping all of this in.
We did really good with that.
Yeah.
We lasted being each other for about 30 seconds.
Not even that.
Like that's
like 7
generous.
seconds.
And then we made each other laugh too much.
Yeah, so for context, our script has me as Jillian and Jillian as Abby. So we can't be bothered to edit it, so we are just I'm gonna read out each other's quote unquote parts. So for this episode, my name is Jillian Ducker.
And I am Abby Woodman.
And you're listening to the HERstory Project podcast. We're not called that anymore. HERstoryPod by the HERstory Project.
Yay!
Welcome. This is episode 3 of series 2.
Yeah, crazy time.
I should probably do some housekeeping first. I'm gonna make it short this time. Please follow us on Instagram, HERstoryProj. Please follow our podcast Instagram, HERstoryProjPod. Please like, subscribe, share, review, all the rest of the things on whatever platform you're listening to us on. We are on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, and Apple Podcasts. It all helps us grow. In this episode, we are talking about gossip papers because something very exciting was released very recently, which was
Bridgerton Series 4.
Now, what we've learnt from Bridgerton Series 4 and media and culture in general over the past couple of months is that basically what a TV show needs to succeed is a Gen Z Asian main character.
Yes. This will get you far.
A white, bisexual, slutty man.
Yes.
And a cottage.
And you'll win.
And that's basically the winning formula. So Bridgerton Series 4 is the close second to Heated Rivalry, and we haven't quite worked out how we can make an episode about Heated Rivalry yet.
I'm working on it.
We are working on it.
Don't worry.
We're both queer historians. We can definitely get there. But until then, we thought we would talk about gossip papers, aka the papers, pamphlets, and real-life publications that inspired Lady Whistledowns' papers in Bridgerton. Before we talk about the history, if there is anyone who has been living under a rock for the last 6 years, would you like to explain Bridgerton to our listeners?
Wow, what an ass. For those that don't know, Bridgerton was originally a novel series that has since been turned into a television series on Netflix produced by Shonda Rhimes. It's a Shondaland production. You love to see it. The idea behind the Bridgertons is that it follows the Bridgerton family and their 7 children?
8.
8 children?
I don't know why I said that so aggressively. Gregory's not even the youngest. Hyacinth is the youngest.
Yeah, but I love her. So it is Gregory that
It's Gregory
that was forgotten in my mind.
So they're named alphabetically. You've got Anthony, Benedict, Colin, Daphne, Eloise, Francesca, Gregory, and Hyacinth.
Cuties. It follows the story of the 8 Bridgerton children as they enter the sort of society of the time, as they enter the town, and try to make matches in the marriage market. The entire series, however, is sort of undercut by Lady Whistledown, which is a society paper that shares gossip about what's going on during the season in London in particular. And that is sort of where the gossip paper connection comes in.
Yeah, so Lady Whistledown, I remember when Bridgerton was first announced, we're describing it as Jane Austen / Gossip Girl. But I think also the reason that Bridgerton remains so popular is because we are really quite obsessed with gossip.
Yeah.
And I think that has been such a constant thing. For as long as we have recorded history, we've loved a gossip, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's very dangerous, but I mean, just thinking about some of the gossip that we have now, you've got celebrity scandals, you've got people talking, to go back to the Heated Rivalry connection, you've got people always gossiping about Hudson Williams and Connor Story, the 2 main actors. Leave them alone for starters, but also are they in a relationship? Are they actually really good friends? Is Connor in a relationship with their other co-star, Francois Arnaud? Is this person sleeping with this person? Blah, blah, blah. We love all of that gossip. You've got things like leaked texts and exposed scandals like the Wagatha Christie scandal from a few years ago, which, for any non-British listeners, was
The best thing ever.
Look up Wagatha Christie.
No. Look up Wayne Rooney and let that be your in. You're welcome.
Ew.
Such an entertaining man with so few brain cells.
Oh, okay, yeah. I thought you were saying that he's hot.
No!
And I was like, that.
I love him because he's such an, goober of a man.
I was like, that man famously looks like a thumb.
Yes, I find it very comforting.
More than that, you've got reality TV shows.
Yeah, you've got accounts like Dumois.
What's Dumois?
Oh!
This is an educational podcast, guy, and we're proving it right now.
Have you ever heard of a blind item?
What are you... You're saying completely new
Wow.
words to me today.
You're not even in the gossip world, let me tell you. So, blind items or sites like Dumois are places where insiders can submit gossip about celebrities. Now, Dumois and sites tend to try to conceivably see how sort of true those rumors might be. This is what they say, at least. But they have huge followings
But on Instagram.
And no one knows a lot of times, similar to Whistledown, who runs these sites. So there's a lot of sort of anonymity around them as well.
Wait, I do know Dumois. I just honestly got confused by your American accent, and I thought you were saying, Doom, Doom. Okay, they've got a live example of a culture difference between...
Good.
Yeah, okay. So you've got Dumois, you've got reality TV shows, you've got... obviously they're mostly scripted, but you've got things like Towie and that's the same show, and Made in Chelsea. Mm-hmm. You've also got things like I Kissed a Girl, which has been cancelled.
Real Housewives.
Real Housewives. Oh my god, the Lord and Saviour that is The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives.
Praise.
The best show on earth. I'm so excited for series 3, 4, whatever it is.
4 now.
Is it 4? Honestly, I'm so excited. But then also just social media. We're constantly posting about each other on social media. Also, as historians, we are professional gossipers.
We are professional gossipers.
Especially in the sort of history we do a lot of social history. We're basically just gossiping about people.
I think what's particularly interesting when you look at the history of gossip is it has long been feminized.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that sort of gossip has existed across history, and the concept of gossip papers in Western culture, particularly since sort of the 17th century, even earlier in some forms, but not with the same sort of mass publication that you saw with the development of early gossip papers. This idea of gossip, though, was almost always considered a feminine or a woman's discipline. That's where you get the idea of wives with wagging tongues.
And scolds, and the scold's bridal, which I will include a picture of on our Instagram this week when this episode goes up, so you can see what that looks like. It was basically this huge steel or metal mask helmet thing, and it had a piece of metal that went in a mouth and pushed down on the tongue.
Almost like a tongue depressor if you've ever been to the doctors. And
it would keep your mouth open, so you would be you could be made to wear it for days, basically. So you'd be drooling. It was humiliating, and it was put on women who basically just wouldn't shut the fuck up. So it's clearly gossip is a very present thing. They were really popular during we're talking medieval and early modern centuries. When we get to the period that we're going to be talking about today, it becomes something slightly new in that I'll tell you what happens. It becomes capitalism.
It becomes cheap.
It becomes marketable.
Yeah.
Rather than being something that happens and you don't want it to happen, it becomes something that you don't want to happen, but you can now make money from. And that's the difference. And a huge reason for that is because of increased literacy rates, the invention of the printing press, invention of penny dreadfuls and cheap printing and publication processes. It means that you can get these things out to people in a much faster way. Gossip no longer relies on people quote unquote gossiping over a cup of tea. It's now something that can be written down and sold. So that's where we come in the long 18th century. So the long 18th century, if you don't know, is basically a period of time that accounts for effectively the Georgian period up until the end of William IV's. The reason we account for it like that is because you see a really significant cultural, political, social, economical, technological shift. And it can be quite easily contained within this century. So we're talking, obviously at the start of the 18th century would be 1700, but for the concept of the long 18th century, really what we're thinking about is 1714, from the death of Queen Anne, the last Stuart, up to 1836, which is when Victoria comes to the throne. So it's kind of about 120 years or so.
Yeah.
And in this century, you see popularization of so many printed and published things. So novels, short stories, newspapers, pamphlets, penny dreadfuls, and scandal sheets, gossip papers. So these gossip columns, as they were really called, or scandal sheets, would then go on to basically form your basis of modern day magazines and newspapers, which love to talk about which celebrity has the skinniest waist at the Oscars.
And this brings us on, I think, to a really interesting point, because we sort of talk about the early modern periods, this period from sort of 1450 until 1700, so the start of this long 18th century. But we really look at, as historians, speaking in very broad strokes here, many sort of look at this period as the start of modernity, of the start of the modern period. Right, and there's sort of lots of reasons for this. You have the birth of the middle class, which is really sort of coming into fruition. Not that it didn't exist in the early modern period, but it sort of widens quite considerably.
Yes, you've basically got, a lot of people will trace the Industrial Revolution to Victoria's reign and the kind of creation of the merchant classes, but they already existed at this point, and they're already growing and increasing in number. Basically, people who weren't born into money start to be able to make money through trade, and that's a significant thing. It also kind of ties into colonialism, the expansion of empire, etc., etc.
You see the stricter and stricter codification of things like modern racism through processes of colonization. You see the standardization of time through things like the invention of the factory and the railroad and the need to have sort of a centralized time system within a zone or a country. You see all of these sort of quite big shifts towards structures that we would still in some ways recognize today. What happens then with gossip in this century? Does it also become something closer to what we would recognize today?
I mean, yes, because you've also got the invention of my favourite thing in the 18th century. You've got the invention of the celebrity.
Yes.
Now, I'm not gonna, insult you by asking you what a celebrity is.
Good, because it's the simplest words that you go, so how would I define that without using the word itself?
How would you define a celebrity without defining the word itself? Now, I think you define it as someone who is famous through their career in particular. A celebrity now, as we might recognise it, might be an actor, might be someone like Timothée Chalamet, and the reason he's been in the papers and causing scandal and gossip lately is because what he's recently said about the opera and the arts. That's an example of celebrity gossip.
But you do have, and I think this is where you can start to see the connections to what celebrity looked like in the early 18th century, you still have the figure of the socialite.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about the Kim Kardashians of the world.
Yes.
I'm also thinking about the Kennedys of the world, those old family names that still exist in places like New York City and London that are still dominating regional gossip columns at the very least.
Yeah, and often more than that now in terms of like social media. They're everywhere on social media because people still want to see what they look like and see what they're wearing. And fundamentally, when celebrity became a thing in the long 18th century, that's what it was. It was finding people, usually obviously your upper classes, your socialites, occasionally your famous actress, as acting and performance became more of a kind of codified thing in this century. It becomes very kind of elitist. This is when you start to see the posh drama schools and things like that becoming a thing, whereas previously acting was effectively seen as a form of prostitution.
And you also have at the same time, right, this big spike in, as you were saying, with this rise of capitalism, of consumer culture. So it's no longer just, right, with this expanding middle classes, it's no longer just that you can see celebrity through print culture, but you can start to purchase pieces of celebrity.
Yes.
Right? And you see this with the middle class obsession with high class values, virtues, and lifestyle.
Absolutely.
This is where you see an obsession with consuming objects that mentally will put you in a new class, that will move you towards the celebrities you are reading about in those gossip papers.
And that's why it's really important that we kind of establish all of these different things, because effectively what we're talking about here is the emergence and invention of capital M marketing.
Yeah.
You have this famous person, a beautiful young woman with blonde hair.
I can only think of names now of scandalous women.
Yeah.
I was about to go for Georgiana.
Let's call her Georgiana. She kind of was a celebrity of this period, but let's call her Georgiana. Let's call her Georgie for short. So Georgie is beautiful, she's blonde, she's everyone's favourite, she's the daughter of an earl or a duke, something like that. She floats around London, she flirts, she goes to parties she probably shouldn't. She wears very pretty dresses and has ridiculous hair, and these gossip papers, your magazines, are writing about her. And the brand new middle classes, especially young girls who are 14, 15, 16, are looking at those papers and saying, Daddy, I want this, and you're rich now, so can you buy it for me? Not sure why they've got a bad American accent, but that's just how I picture...
Veruca Salt.
It's Veruca Salt vibes, right? So you see these people and you want to be them. You want to emulate that. What then emerges out of that is a capitalist kind of culture where companies will create dupes and copies of what that famous person has made in order to sell it. And then it keeps going on and on and on and on. And that is the root of kind of modern capitalism.
Yeah.
And that's how the root of modern capitalism is all down to the emergence of the bourgeoisie and the gossip paper in the 18th century. There we go, goodbye.
In history, we're all haunted by three men. We are Marx, Foucault, and Freud. To bring it
honestly didn't know which three men you were going to say, because you could say that sentence about so many people.
But these three in particular.
But yeah, let's talk about these three.
Let's talk about Marx though in particular, right? And we can get to Foucault and Freud a little bit later, but because they'll come back. This is where, if you've ever heard of Marx's idea of the conscious unconscious amongst the proletariat, marketing in this consumer culture is where you start to get, in some ways, that early infiltration of thought, right? Because this print is more or less acting as a form of capitalist propaganda in a lot of ways as well, particularly a lot of early print. Now, we can still say this, in my personal opinion, with my media and culture degree today, that print media, particularly marketing, is still one of the prime tools of capitalism in creating that conscious unconscious within the proletariat, within the working classes. Because if you are filled with such an obsession for material goods, with a yearning for what you don't have, you never realize the power you do have.
Okay.
That's my Marx sidebar.
But you do give us a really good kind of segue. It's almost like you've also got the script in front of you.
I know.
Into what facilitates the various different things that lead to gossip papers in the 18th century. And we've already mentioned it. It's the printing boom. It's your printing presses. So,
give me that Gutenberg press, baby. I'm talking Martin Luther.
Okay, this is not an episode about religious reformation.
Refocus. I could talk about that for such a long time.
Yeah, we're going to refocus. So, the printing press. In 1695, a thing called the Printing Act lapses.
Yeah.
So basically before this, the government with a capital G, really heavily restricted printing presses. So that meant that basically the kind of production of news, printed news, was really heavily controlled. But after 1695, anyone could start a printing business. So that meant that at the end of the 17th century, suddenly you've got newspapers, pamphlets and prints exploding. Now previously there had been some. We've talked about it when we've talked about the 17th century. You have people writing libel papers and scandal sheets a lot earlier about the likes of Nell Gwynn, Barbara Palmer, all the scandalous ladies of the 1660s. But you don't have a boom where they are talking about things that aren't directly related to the most powerful people in the country.
And you also don't have an illicit trade anymore. So what's happening sort of before this period is if you were trying to publish something that went against a government line, you had to do it largely abroad and then sneak it into the country. This is where you get, particularly during things like counter-Reformation movements, sort of Jesuit networks that are sneaking Catholic literature across the country. But you're never going to get the same circulation.
No. So a lot of scandal papers actually in the 1660s and 1670s, like I just mentioned, about Charles II and his many ladies, were actually Dutch. They'd been printed and written in the Netherlands and were then shipped over. Likewise, you had Jesuit papers and pro-Catholic papers printed in France and Spain, and they were then brought over to England and distributed that way. But like Jillian says, they could never, ever reach a kind of full expansion and spread everywhere around the country. They could barely spread everywhere throughout London. But what happens in 1695 is anyone can start a printing business, which meant that between 1713 and 1801, newspaper circulation jumps from 2.4 million copies annually in England to 16 million.
That's insane.
That is a huge, huge jump. Now, obviously, if you put those numbers in context today, minimal. Think about the population size. And think about how these things actually moved around the country. You can't just access it from your phone on Apple Plus. They are being put on a frickin' wagon, horse and carted around the country. So this is huge, and it creates something that historians like to call a new public culture, which is what we've already talked about, your kind of growth of celebrity, bourgeoisie, socialites, etc., etc.
And I think it's potentially important here to say that it is not that a public culture did not exist before this point. You had public culture, but it was much more localized.
Yeah.
So you might have a public culture within London or even within a neighborhood in London. What you don't have up until this point is a public culture that is going to expand an entire nation state.
Yes.
Or even have a concept of a nation state, right? This is something that's also born out of this public print and public cultural boom.
And that's why it's really important that we've already mentioned links to imperialism and colonialism, because what's really important, and might sound like, but you're just talking about gossip papers, but it's really important to note that all of this is fundamentally related to an expansion of nationhood and therefore of imperialism, colonialism, and ideas of empire. It also, to kind of call back to your point just now, idea of a kind of public culture did exist, but again, only with those people who are literally at the very pinnacle of society.
Yeah.
If there was gossip about the king or the queen or Charles II's many mistresses, people knew about it. People knew about it. People in Wales and Bristol and Cornwall and Scotland and Newcastle knew about Henrietta Maria and Charles I. Maybe they didn't know the facts, but they knew the stories that were circulated. What they didn't know was who the socialites, daughters of earls, duchesses, widowed, blah 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 were in London. They knew their local quote-unquote celebrity, their local daughters and their local kind of upper class networks. They knew of them, they would have gossiped about them, of course they would have. But they didn't have a centralised idea of a kind of national identity, and therefore they didn't have a centralised idea until this point of kind of almost like nationalised gossip.
Yeah, but that is genuinely what it is. It's this idea that, right, even if gossip about the king was moving around the country, that's being passed by word of mouth. That story is going to alter slightly place to place. You don't have that with a mass-printed gossip sheet because everyone is reading the same thing. Now, they might be interpreting that differently based off of regionalisms or localisms, but that is very different from having a verbal story that is being passed around, and that is an essential tool in nation building.
Absolutely, and I think something else you really see grow out of this is it's not just about celebrity and culture, it's also about people's awareness of politics. In this period you really start to see a point about political awareness and news beyond a point which affects you previously, historically. If you think about revolutions and rebellions, they come out of a very kind of localized point of discontent about religion or money, taxes, etc., etc. At this point, you start to see the growth of national movements, not just because everyone is getting behind either Puritans or Royalists, but because everyone believes in the same thing. There is a reason why throughout the Victorian period you then see the growth of Luddite movements and Chartism. This is the root of it. It's people learning that there is more than their village and there is more than their church.
Yeah. And not only are people reading about it, they're talking about it. So this is where you have, in France in particular, the birth of the salon.
Yes.
And in England, potentially a bit more so than the salon, you have this idea of the coffee house.
Absolutely. Coffee houses, so important. I have been waiting for, how old am I? I've been waiting for 6 years for someone to ask me about the emergence of coffee house culture since I studied the module in my second year of uni.
Tell us about the coffee house.
So coffee houses, not your typical cafe like now. They're basically, I think, to tie it back to Bridgerton, they're basically the first version of your gentleman's club.
Yeah.
Now, various clubs and gentlemen's clubs had existed beforehand, but the version that we see in Bridgerton, which I think is what people will recognise, is effectively a coffee house. An evolved coffee house. What's a really ridiculously poncy neighbourhood in London?
Marylebone?
No, not that type of poncy, like hipster. So imagine you're in Hackney.
Yeah.
And
you're at Jolene.
And you're at Jolene.
You're at Jolene on a Saturday.
Right, so you're at Jolene on a Saturday in Hackney.
And you hate yourself.
And you do hate yourself. But more than that, you hate your wife, you hate your kids, and you hate fucking everyone who even looks at you the wrong way. Your only respite is your besties, who you have a slightly, probably homoerotic relationship with, who you go to Jolene together with. And although it wouldn't have actually been in Hackney because that would have been like fucking miles out. In reality, this would have been in like Soho. But for the context now, you would have gone there almost every single day. And you would have lit up your pipe, you'd have started smoking, drank your shit-ass coffee, and started gossiping about everything. And I will point out that these were like pretty much all men. Women didn't go to coffee houses. So a point can probably be made about the kind of gender discrepancy of how gossip is a woman's thing. Men were definitely also doing it.
100%.
So a coffee house is basically a gathering point, right? It's where men go to gossip. Now, you mentioned salons in France. Obviously, similar cultures are developing elsewhere. France is, leading up to a revolution at this point, so they're tricky. Yeah. But salons, in contrast, were primarily female spaces. And the thing is, you also don't really see a distinct place for women's gossip to develop and find a place because they already had it, right?
Yeah. It was the market, it was your front stoop, it was...
Exactly. Going back to Bridgerton, again, what you see in almost every single episode, especially in this series, in series 4, are the maids and servants of the houses gossiping. In the first series, you see the housekeeper, whose name I can't remember, and Daphne's maid conspiring with Lady Bridgerton, Violet, to gossip with Lord Berbrooke's mother's maid. So many different things.
Yeah.
But the maid of Lord Berbrooke's house to find out something that means that Daphne won't marry him. And that's how women had used gossip for centuries at this point. So salon and coffee house culture, really, really important to kind of mention. Specifically because they were a place for people to gossip, to talk. They were a place for people to read these newspapers. They literally provided newspapers and pamphlets to attract customers. It's effectively like an early 18th century version of, I was going to say Twitter. I feel like Threads is taking over from Twitter now.
Yeah.
Especially if you're like on the fan fiction side of the internet.
You're on Threads.
You're on Threads, right?
So when do we move from this sort of boom of print culture, this boom sort of culture, coffee house culture and public discourse, to the birth of gossip papers?
So I would say at this point, the early 18th century, you haven't got things that are specifically about these kind of scandalous elites.
Yeah.
But then you get to the 1770s. They kind of nearing the end of the 18th century here. And at that point, you've got things like Town and Country magazine. Running a column about the sex lives of England's elites.
Get me to the archive. Get me to the archive.
So, because obviously everything has to be secret, the column used coded names, but obviously also everyone knew who the people were, right?
Yeah. This is one of my favorite things about this period is if you ever want a fun primary source, look at gossip columns from this time period, because with just a little bit of historical context, you will very easily be able to piece together who these people that are being named are. There's a great poem about Robert Walpole in particular, and thinking that is published in this time, where it is so clear what every single character in the poem, or who every single character in the poem is. It's just brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah, because the names weren't exactly subtle. No. Because obviously you want people to still be able to know what you're talking about. Another really good example of these kind of coded names and early kind of specific gossip papers is the Morning Post. So this covered social events in obsessive detail. Social events, I'm talking about your balls, your debuts, things like that.
Your big fets.
So, for example, when the Prince Regent of, Bridgerton George fame, Prince George, later George IV, hosted a little party in 1811. The Morning Post reported on the really, really important information. Who danced with whom?
Okay, but I want that.
You want that?
I want someone to cover, the variety after party of the Grammys or the Oscars today and tell me, I don't want to know who went. I don't want to know dance with who. I want to know what groups of women went to the bathroom together.
Okay, that's basically the story of Taylor Swift meeting who was probably Jennifer Aniston in the bathroom at the Met Gala.
No. I don't want to know who met in the bathroom. I want to know who went together to the bathroom together.
And did some secret coke.
Yes, this is important information for me. What groups of women gathered and went to the bathroom together? This tells you a lot.
It does tell you a lot, but it also wasn't exactly like that. That's not really what they were reporting on.
I know.
What they were reporting on, because, was actually things like, the first couple who tripped on the light, fantastic toe were Earl Percy and the accomplished beauty, Lady Jane Montague. Firstly, does anyone actually understand what that means? No, me neither. I think it just means that they had a dance together. They probably danced together more than once. Oh, scandalous.
Ooh, they were getting married.
So this is now where we get into the real Lady Whistledown era, because you've got people actually reporting on the kind of high society events, the celebrities, the socialites.
So for people who might not know, when do we move? So we're talking about sort of with the birth of the gossip paper, the late sort of 1700s. When does Bridgerton start?
Okay, so there's actually a bit of discrepancy between the history that we're talking about and Bridgerton. So I'm going to try and bridge them. So Bridgerton covers the Regency period, the end of the Regency period. Now, if you don't know what the Regency period actually refers to, it's not just what we refer to all Jane Austen novels with. It is the period in which the eldest son of George III and Queen Charlotte, future George IV, is acting as the regent, the Prince Regent of England.
For crazy pants.
Because his dad has gone fucking mental.
For the Americans, this is directly after the American Revolution. Yeah. Actually, it might start during the American Revolution.
Well, the Regency period with a capital R isn't until a bit later. But
because we're kicking off in 1776.
Yeah, he starts going... So he has his first batch of madness really early on, but it only lasts about 3 months. He doesn't fully sink into straight up complete madness until the early 19th century, the end of the long 18th century. Yeah. So Bridgerton itself, the show, I believe covers the years maybe, I want to say like 1816, and the show is now, I believe, on 1819, which technically means Queen Charlotte needs to be dead.
No, don't say it.
They're not going to kill her.
She's not allowed to die. That's my least favourite fact, is that she dies first.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's not massively relevant to this, but if anyone is watching Bridgerton, this current series is set in 1819, which is the year that Queen Charlotte dies in history, which, obviously, this is actually historical fantasy, so we're not going to worry about that.
She'll live forever.
Probably. Golda Rochevelle. Is that her name? I think so.
Love her. Love her in Lady Macbeth. Side note. You should all go watch that film.
So even though Bridgerton is set in the Regency era, I think the reason Bridgerton, the books and the show, are set in the Regency era is because the hair, makeup and dresses are so much better. than a little bit earlier. Because the end of the 18th century is not a very glamorous time. Not because anyone was particularly dirty, their fashion sense was just god-awful. But in reality, the heyday of scandal sheets was actually a lot earlier.
Yeah, so you're talking about the 1770s and 1780s, really.
Exactly. So by around 1770, there were approximately 60 newspapers printed in London every single week.
Yeah. And you, again, for the American context, you also see print culture and the rise of gossip papers playing quite a big role in the American Revolution as well.
Yeah.
One of the things that really kicked things off during the American Revolution is the stamp tax. And this was a tax placed on every printed good purchase in the colonies. It was basically an additional printing tax. All of your printed goods had to be stamped with an official seal that made them sellable. That was the additional tax that you paid for. What it did was restrict the flow of information within the colonies. And this had huge backlashes. So this is one of the big events, the Stamp Act, alongside the Tea Act in particular, that leads to some of the first revolutionary actions in America.
Yeah. I don't have anything intelligent to say after that, so I'm just going to say,
Yeah.
Cool. Going back to what's really important, a British context, because fuck the American tea-destroying ways.
You've never wanted to pay taxes. If you were curious, that's the moral of that story.
It's the fact that you never wanted to pay taxes and now you have, like, the most unnecessarily complex tax system. Like, at least in the UK, I'm just like, yeah, I get my paycheck and my tax is already gone. I'm like, I never see it. I don't have to...
So are mine, and I still have to file.
What? Okay, anyway.
So, by the Bridgerton period, what I'm getting at is there is quite a sophisticated network of gossip columns and papers.
Exactly. So I want to call everyone back to the first series of Bridgerton for a moment. Everyone knows what a scandal sheet is, right? All of the characters. But these papers, the Lady Whistledown papers, are written by someone new. They're written by a lady. Now, spoiler alert, didn't really happen.
Right.
Nah, not true. But there was an incredibly sophisticated news network. So according to Victoria Gardner, who is a historian, by the way, Londoners moved between coffee houses. And when I say Londoners, I mean men. Moved between coffee houses searching for the latest news and gossip. So she describes it as a daily buzz around news acquisition. Obviously then those men would take it home, feed it back to their wives, who would then feed it to their servants in various ways, but also the maids and the servants would pick up their own news, and those systems would still keep going on. We're talking specifically here about the printed papers.
So one thing I'm particularly curious about, right, particularly in the context of Lady Whistledown, is how did no one get sued for libel? Because we know that libel suits are a thing, particularly during that heavily restricted press era, sort of across the early modern period, and then again during a lot of the revolutionary activity that's happening in France, where there's sort of equal concerns about an English revolution. But there seems to be sort of this period in between, this golden age in between, where you could print what you wanted to. What was happening in that period that allowed for that freedom?
So it wasn't that they could print what they wanted. It's because of something we've already mentioned in this episode, and that is the nicknames. So basically, libel law is, like, incredibly weak at this point. So if you're named directly, like, if you wrote a paper at me and said, Abby Woodman has done this and blah, 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 I could then take you to court for libel. But that's not what they did. They were cleverer than that. So public figures were referred to with initials or really vague descriptions. Now, one really good example is the king, who featured in a lot of gossip papers because he'd gone mad, was referred to often as a certain great personage. So you're just kind of avoiding saying who they actually are.
Yeah.
And by that, you're avoiding actually getting in trouble for what you're saying. Because, think about it, like, if that person then is like, you wrote this about me, they're actually just confirming what you've wrote is true. So even if everyone knows that it's true, they can't do anything about it.
You don't want to say anything.
Yeah.
And I guess what that allows for, really, is also for gossip to become a political tool.
Exactly.
So I'm thinking about particularly the conflict with Robert Walpole when he's Prime Minister over the Regency. Gossip is a huge tool in that concept, with both the Queen and Walpole at separate times, more or less weaponizing gossip papers and this use of nicknames and sort of political subterfuge to get towards these greater ends. I like that. Bring back gossip as a fun political tool.
I think it is
not a distraction for war.
It is incredibly powerful.
Look at the Epstein files and the fact that in the period before those files are released, the power that gossip still has in the aftermath of those.
Yeah, exactly. Thinking about kind of press, I think we can tie this in quite well to kind of current gossip. Epstein files. Stella Tilliard is a historian who's written about kind of celebrity in the 18th century, and specifically what she has said about scandal and libel is that a combination of free press and weak libel laws created a culture of gossip that was actually freer and more direct than today. Because what you can get away with then is just referring to someone as a person of great personage.
And we all know who that is.
But what can you do about it?
Yeah.
Now, you are almost tied by press laws to be super explicit, which means if you aren't 100% correct with your facts and citations, you can't print it.
And this is where I think accounts like Dumois or blind item accounts gain so much traction and popularity today because they are posting these items. Dumois is a little bit different, but for blind items, particularly with celebrities largely unnamed.
Yeah.
And it gives them greater freedom, basically, to feed this rumor mill. Because we know who they're talking about. We can make an educated guess on who that person is, but they've not named them.
And because they aren't a newspaper with a capital N, they aren't tied to the same libel and press laws, which dictate things like...
I think in a lot of ways today, sort of social media is filling that void that gossip papers served in this period, sort of unregulated press activity.
Absolutely is. However, I don't want to let people think that just because laws were looser doesn't mean that there were real life consequences to these scandal sheets.
Yes.
So let's talk about the Duchess of Kingston.
Yes.
So the Duchess of Kingston, Elizabeth Chudley, real life scandal. She was put on trial in 1776 for bigamy.
Take a second, because I know there's someone out there who's not going to know what bigamy means.
Do you want me to explain it? Or are you letting people Google it?
No. Go ahead. Give a quick Give a quick def for the people.
Simply put, bigamy is that you are married to more than one person, specifically two people.
Yeah.
Separately.
Right.
Technically legal in the Bible, I think.
And in the state of Utah, the great state of Utah.
Is it?
Mm-hmm. That's why all the polygamy, that's why the Mormons are out there.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Although, I did some research into Mormonism, and not as polygamous as I thought. Anyway.
Yeah, it's not. No, it's more of a... It's quite an old tradition, and it's really only popular today among extreme sects.
Yeah.
So LDS, for example, or not LDS, sorry, LFDS.
Interesting.
Could do a whole episode on Mormonism. I grew up with all the Mormons.
We will do a whole episode on Mormonism because I'm obsessed with the secret lives of Mormon wives, as I mentioned at the start of this episode.
They're not real Mormons.
They're not real Mormons, but I do love that show. So going back to Elizabeth Chudley, in 1776 she was put on trial for bigamy.
Dramatic.
So basically what happened was that she was already secretly married, or she was already married. I don't know if their first one was a secret. But then she got married again.
Right, so you can't do that.
To a duke, making her, quote unquote, doubly noble. Which is a shit headline.
What in the sweet home Alabama?
It's like also just like such a bad headline, I'm sorry. But obviously, so Elizabeth Chudley was like landed gentry, basically. That meant that she was effectively a peer. She was the Duchess of Kingston. Which meant that when this got found out and it had to go to trial, she had to be tried in the House of Lords.
So we're talking about quite a, at least in London society, a public trial.
Because remember, at this point, you don't have Made in Chelsea. You don't have Dumois. You don't have people gossiping. You don't have your Uni Fashions page. You don't have any of that. You've got Elizabeth Chudley on trial in the House of Lords.
Everyone's there.
And it was so popular. People were there to write about it. People were there to witness it. That women were warned by newspapers not to wear tall hairstyles because they would block the view. Because seating was so limited. Because in the House of Lords, if you don't know, in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, you can actually go in and watch. And then following that, coffee houses were then filled with spectators and satirical artists. And the trial lasted days, and it was so popular, such a media sensation, that even the judge was paid an absolute fortune. He was paid £1,000 per day. I'm not going to do it for you, but just go and look up 1776. Just type in the National Archives currency converter and type in £1,000 in 1776, because I guarantee you that is a couple of million by now. Another scandal.
Tell me about them. I love this one. I just love how bad this goes for the claimant.
Because, like, Elizabeth Chudley gets prosecuted and found guilty of bigamy and blah, blah, blah. But it's not the Worsley scandal, is it?
No. There's something about the Worsley... The Worsley scandal speaks to the Jane Austen in you.
I think that's what it is. It's almost heartwarming in how awful it is.
It is the plot of a really poorly written historical fiction.
Yeah.
But it happened, and that makes it better.
So next time someone tells you that HERstoryPod is not realistic,
this case,
point them to my TikTok and my Instagram, because I've made several videos about that. But also, just point them towards this case. So the Worsley scandal involves a man called Sir Richard Worsley and his wife Seymour.
Suddenly Seymour. Poor girl.
No. So Seymour, which, you know, feels very like 2010s American as a name. Like the
1960s West Coast, yes.
Yeah, like the name Seymour, like you've taken a surname and made it a first name, like, oh, edgy. Anyway, so Seymour.
All I can hear is Suddenly Seymour from Little Shop of Horrors. That's all that's playing in my head every time you say Seymour. Particularly the version with the girl from Victorious.
I haven't listened to that.
Best cast.
Which girl from Victorious? Tori? Jade?
Jade. I was like, the good one, you know.
The hot one.
The one who's still famous, that's not Ariana Grande.
So the Worsley scandal, like I say, involved Sir Richard Worsley and his wife Seymour. Now, Seymour ran away with Richard's friend, Captain George Bissett.
Okay, Kitty Bennett. Yeah, I mix them up. I'm gonna be really honest. I never call either one by the right name.
Lydia Bennett. Anyway, Richard then sued Bissett for criminal conversation, which basically means damages for adultery.
Right.
And then the trial, predictably, becomes this entire media circus. So evidence emerged throughout the trial that Richard himself had once shown Bissett his wife bathing through a window.
And you know what? This feels like the 18th century version of sending someone your girlfriend's nudes.
Yeah.
And I hate that. But the cartoons from it are first of all, if you don't know, cartoons from this period of history are the best cartoons of all time. Highly recommend.
Yes. Satirical cartoons, I would have already posted a lot of them by the time you listen to this episode.
The satirical cartoons, particularly from the Worsley scandal, are hilarious.
Trust me, there will be a whole post incoming featuring James Gilray's caricatures mocking the affair.
All of this to say, none of this helps our man.
None of this helps poor Richard. He did win.
Did he though?
Technically.
How much did he win at?
He won 1 shilling.
Right. So he was rich. So we have this massive scandal that's really taking hold, particularly in the sort of later 18th century. And I'm talking about the 18th century proper, not the long 18th century here.
Boo.
I know, I don't like the long 18th, I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was saying boo, the 18th century proper. I like the long 18th century. I think it's really fun. I love referring to things as the long 18th century. It's like when so guys, also we haven't announced this. I'm doing a PhD next year, and I refer to the period I'm studying it as the long 17th century.
See, I like the long 17th century.
Yeah.
I support the long 17th century. I do think that's a thing. I hate the long 18th century. I think it's such bullshit.
Okay, I've touched a nerve here. Anyway, what was your question going to be?
I don't remember. Oh yes, so we have this boom of gossip at the end of the 18th century in particular. Then, as we sort of briefly touched on, you have sort of an increase in libel legislation again towards this period of sort of revolutionary activity across Europe. But then the gossip sheets sort of come back. We see them sort of across the Victorian period. I'm thinking particularly here of the continual popularity of trials, things like the trial of Oscar Wilde and the popularization of the term queer, which happens largely through gossip sheets, first in England and then in America. When does the gossip sheet sort of start to fall off then?
So after these two kind of big scandals, obviously they weren't the only ones, but they're the ones we've spoken about today. That's kind of the height of them, like the 1770s through to kind of the early 1790s.
Mm-hmm.
So throughout the kind of turn of the century, i.e. when you have quite a lot of political drama happening. So you've got the aftermath of the American Revolution, George III going mad.
The French Revolution.
The French Revolution, and then the subsequent Napoleonic Wars.
So there's a lot of political distress. Not to mention, across all of this, England is terrified of a revolution happening again on English soil.
Something we can talk about in the context of Bridgerton is that I do think... So, Bridgerton is historical fantasy, right? It exists, firstly, in a parallel universe in which racism ceased to exist in 1761.
Because Charlotte was black, yes.
Yeah. It also seems to exist in a parallel universe in which the French Revolution doesn't seem to have happened because no one is off fighting in the Napoleonic Wars.
Also, no one mentions colonialism once except Lady Danbury.
Yeah.
And that also seems to be a weird historical past and not present.
Yeah. It's like, when exactly did colonialism and imperialism happen?
Worth noting, there were people of colour
Absolutely
in London in this time. 100%.
A little bit earlier, but read the book Black
Tudors is a brilliant case study for the presence of particularly Africans and North Africans across the early modern period. We know now that even in the medieval period, there was much more trade happening between Europe, North Africa, and what they would have referred to as Levant, as the Levant, what we today would have referred to as the Middle East. We used to perceive there would have been quite a lot, actually, of cultural interaction happening, particularly in metropoles like London in this time. You were not seeing people of colour infiltrate the nobility in the way you are seeing in Bridgerton. You, in rare instances, would see merchant elite, non-white merchant elite, sometimes start to break into upper echelons, but largely as a bit of a party trick.
Absolutely. Even, I'm trying to think of the name of the film, which does actually follow the real story of Belle.
It's called Belle.
Is the film
film's
just called Belle?
Brilliant film.
Excellent film.
Draco Malfoy's in it.
Okay, that wasn't going to be my go-to. I was trying to think of the name of the actress who plays Belle, because she's in Doctor Who.
She's brilliant, yeah.
She is fabulous. So Belle, the film, again I will link it in the show notes, is a really great example of that rare occasion in which a person of colour, a black woman, I don't want to say the word infiltrates, because,
breaks into.
But then I also don't really want to say that because it's not really her action or her choice. She is the illegitimate daughter of a nobleman with an enslaved woman who was then brought back to England to be raised and live with her cousin, half-sister? Cousin, her white cousin. From all the papers, she did live as kind of her cousin's equal, but there is a really famous portrait which I will try and find and include
where she's depicted as a servant.
Where she's depicted as a servant, and it's a really weird and really almost like fetishized, exoticized portrait, right?
Yeah. She is very much depicted in a romanticized slave garb, more or less. It's a very similar depiction of what you would have seen of a romanticized portraiture of American slave life in that period.
Absolutely. And similarly, again, earlier, another portrait I will include, there's going to be so many source posts for this episode, is the portrait of Louise de Keroualle, who was one of Charles II's mistresses, with the name of the portrait is literally Louise de Keroualle with a slave girl. And it's this young, black, enslaved girl kind of at her right-hand side, and it's such a caricature. All of that to say, Bridgerton, point A, historical fantasy. Point B, completely fucking insane. Because not only does it exist in an alternate universe, it also seems to exist in an alternate universe where absolutely none of these people have any sort of financial difficulty ever in their whole lives.
No.
Except for the Featheringtons in, like, series 1.
Yeah. Not to mention that, again, this is a point in the history of the English nobility where you do see noble houses start to financially falter because they've not caught up with capitalism.
Absolutely. And I think, okay, there might be a kind of point to say, throughout the show you do see that the Bridgertons are supposedly like really, really good with that money. And they're really, really good at investing and XYZ, all the other things. But most families at this point were refusing to invest. In fact, most families at this point were at the point of Bridgerton in the kind of 1810s, 1820s, were seeing the slow decline of slavery. Yeah. And that is where for the past 150 years they had made their money. That is what they were surviving on. The horrible truth that we don't want to acknowledge is the fact that in reality the Bridgertons would have had so much money because they owned plantations and therefore they owned people. That doesn't fit into our kind of romantic version of the story, so we kind of glaze over it.
Yeah.
And they do seem to be kind of good with their money in the show. They're investing, blah, 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 all the rest of it. But what was really happening in this point is people were making shit investments. They were trying to look after rundown, drafty houses. They were just spending money and spending more money and spending more money like it was just going to keep coming. And then eventually what you see are people losing their country houses, people losing their wealth, becoming...
trying to marry into American money. This is where you get the concept of the American brides.
Absolutely.
If you want to talk about the Buccaneers, for example, is
Absolutely.
Another sort of historical fiction in point to this time period. This is where you see particularly the English nobility for the first time accepting American wealth into the fold because it will prop up these basically rotting estates.
Yeah, and then if we fast forward a little bit, within the same context to early 20th century, Downton Abbey, Cora Grantham, Cora is an American heiress, and the reason that Robert Crawley chose her to marry her before the series starts is because she has a lot of money. And that became a really popular thing to happen throughout the later 19th century. So that's kind of what we're moving towards. And that's another thing that Bridgerton really kind of glosses over. Bridgerton's a really fascinating piece of media. It's so fantastical. Hey, Charlotte should be dead. Let's just go through the list. Charlotte should be dead. There's this idea, there is a kind of historical rumour that maybe Charlotte had a little bit of more, which means Islamic blood.
Particularly, they think Northern African, so modern Algeria, Morocco, potentially heritage from that area.
But it wouldn't really have been noticeable, otherwise they wouldn't have allowed her to marry George.
Interestingly, it was semi-noticeable.
You see it in the portrait
see a couple
with her facial
of
features, right?
African phenotypes, but what you see, and you can see this actually in gossip from the time, she was thought to have a slightly darker complexion. You're living in a time where that sort of Elizabethan obsession with whiteness is still carrying on. So she's quite heavily powdered in a lot of photos. You do see some African phenotypes that potentially do, again, suggest that North African heritage. But what I think we don't necessarily understand is a lot of that, again, is happening through the gossip mill.
Absolutely.
They are not official political conversations. There is no official acknowledgement in any sense that Charlotte would have had any African, Moorish, Islamic descent, Arabic descent. None of that would have ever been acknowledged, because you're right, she never would have been allowed to marry into the English royal family if that was the case. That was an easy way to discredit the royal family, whether it was true or not.
Yeah. And I think, I'm pretty sure historians did some research into this and found that, yes, she did probably have a Arabic, North African ancestor, a great something grandmother, and it was, I think, 9 generations back. And Charlotte having facial features and phenotypes that did tie back to that heritage was almost like a fluke, because at that point, the family was predominantly white. If it was noticeable enough to make a political conversation around it, a genuine political conversation, she would never have been allowed to marry George.
No. It became a political conversation when there needed to be a way to discredit the royal family, particularly during a lot of those Regency conflicts.
Absolutely. And now, I love that those conversations even existed, because it means we get Golda as Queen Charlotte.
Yeah.
And she's, like, genuinely one of my favourite characters in any TV show. But I don't want anyone to imagine that this period of history was in any way more romantic than it was, fairer than it was, better than it was. It was horrible, okay? In reality, it was kind of really fucking horrible.
Yeah. And this is where, I mean, one of the reasons that those African phenotypes at that point could have been used against Charlotte was because this is where you see such a heavily codification of modern racism.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that those phenotypes meant something different about a person are emerging in this period, and that's why they can become that target. Before then, likely, they would not have been commented on. And I think that in and of itself is a fascinating point about this period. And this obsession with gossip through the lens of racialization, gender norms, right, which are inherently linked to that colonial racial matrix. And this idea of there being very proper forms of behavior, not just by class, but by race and gender as well. What happens, particularly across the Victorian period, because I'm guessing that's when things start to shift, because everything does.
Yeah, absolutely.
What happens to gossip papers that sort of change things up a little bit?
So from the end of the kind of 18th century proper, as you said it earlier, through to the kind of the end of the Regency, you do have the occasional gossip paper. You've still got scandal sheets. You don't have anything as big as Lady Whistledown happening. The marriage mart is a real thing. People are experiencing, people are writing about it, people are gossiping about it. But generally the kind of favour and love for these big, amazing, scandalous gossip papers and gossip sheets has kind of worn out. And by the 1840s, mainstream newspapers are really starting to adopt a very kind of Victorian sensibility, you could say.
Strict morals. We're not gossiping. And here's the thing about the Victorians, right? They are obsessed. This is where I think gossip moves from being printed to being spoken again.
Yeah.
Because Victorians are so obsessed with sex and the restriction of sex, that to write about sex publicly without some kind of moral tone is no longer acceptable in the same way. You can talk about it behind those doors, and they did excessively.
They loved, like, genuinely, the Victorians were obsessed with sex, fetish, latex.
We're bringing it back to Foucault, okay?
Piercings, go on.
We're bringing it back to Foucault. Foucault will tell you a lot of the modern obsession with a sexual binary and proper sexual mores and behaviors really takes root. It's born from the colonial period. This does not come from Foucault because he's sort of a half-baked historian. But what he does understand is that a lot of this is really codified much more strongly across the Victorian period because they're so obsessed with sex.
Yeah.
They cannot stop talking about it, but they will not write about it.
They are so obsessed with sex. Like, it genuinely gets to a point where you're like, are you okay?
Sex and eating mummies, that was their thing, man.
Oh my god, I forgot about the mummies. We really need to get, like, an Egyptian historian. Egyptologist, that's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
To just tell us about the mummy thing, because...
Yeah.
Fascinating. Anyway, so...
Do the Victorians start to, because this feels like something the Victorians would do. When does the legislature start coming in? When are we
Not for a bit
legally
longer.
restricting?
So, a good 20 years into Victorian England.
Okay.
So, things were already starting to, like, disappear. So, really popular scandal gossip sheets had been The Age and The Satirist. They went bye-bye. So, they decided to pass, in 1857, an act called the Obscene Publications Act, which basically meant bye-bye to any sort of decent scandal paper.
You couldn't discuss sex anymore, basically, in the paper.
Basically. But gossip didn't disappear.
No. How could it?
How could it? People still loved it. And by I mean loved the gossip, I mean they just loved to talk about other people. So the Victorian newspapers decided to come up with something new. So they developed a column which they called The Lounger, which genuinely sounds like the creepy name you would give to the guy at your local pub.
Yep.
Right? So these collected rumours from elite clubs and salons, and my notes say that they presented them more carefully, which I think means that they didn't explicitly say who was having sex with who.
Yeah. We were being a little bit more...
Diplomatic?
I was gonna say confusing, but yeah, diplomatic is...
Yeah. I mean, diplomacy is confusing, right?
Yeah. We were throwing purposeful confusion into the game plan now.
Yeah. Rather than wanting to make sure people understood us by being very explicit.
Yeah.
At this point we had to we were writing them personally.
Yeah.
These writers had to kind of hide who they were talking about a little bit better.
Yeah. And again, I think the one sort of exception here across the Victorian period, which you can see, is court cases. So once something becomes public discussion, once it becomes a state of public affairs, you will see potentially more gossip around it. I'm thinking again particularly about trials like Oscar Wilde's for sodomy.
Yeah, so specifically when you mention Oscar Wilde, that's also where my mind goes. And what also comes to mind here is how Oscar Wilde's trial also really crosses over the boundary to something which is not socially acceptable by Victorian standards. That's also where you see it. So, and other things that you see a lot of gossip papers about are women who are accused of adultery, of murder, and you see sodomy trials and trials against homosexual people really, really amped up in the papers. So whereas previously scandal papers would focus on anyone and anything, as long as it was a little bit juicy, now gossip carries a political message.
And not that it didn't always, but I would say a much stronger social, moral implication to it, where we're not just talking about these things, we are actively judging the actions that are being undertaken here.
Absolutely, yeah.
And again, not that that didn't always play a part in gossip in some ways, either in the reading or the actual writing, but it becomes much more explicit across the Victorian period. Again, to come back to Foucault, of this strict judgment of action.
And I think it really also dials down to a Victorian obsession with sex. And I say that because I know that there is one man that you promised you were going to talk about at the start of this episode that you haven't been able to mention yet. Freud.
He's my least favourite of the three. I hate psychoanalytics.
So, Freud, famously obsessed with sex, much like the Victorians.
But yeah.
Do you want to say anything about that, man?
I mean, right, we want to talk about set ideas of womanhood and manhood. From a psychoanalytical perspective, so much of that comes down to Freud. Freud really, and you can read this one of two ways, but fundamentally understood that people were conditioned into their gender identities. Now, he took a much more biological approach to that conditioning than we would today, and that many critical theorists will read him as today, or repurpose his psychoanalytical theory for, but fundamentally Freud understood that there was a certain amount of social conditioning that was necessary for gender identities to emerge in their modern formations. Right, that is the foundation of the Electra and Oedipal complexes. Mental, in his mind, biological complexes, biological processes that all children go through to establish their gendered identities.
So true, bestie, that's so true. Clicks for Freud.
Clicks for Freud. So you do really see these Freudian ideas of gender undercutting gossip again, I think, across the Victorian period in this medicalization of gender and proper behaviors. This is where you see a real and noted rise in cases of female hysteria, for example. Right, hysteria in different sort of forms and formulations always used as a way to get rid of difficult women, more or less, but it's now being used as sort of a real catch-all for any woman who's existing outside of social norms. A lot of that moral panic of the Victorian era is generated through things like gossip.
Yeah.
And public media, whether that be, right, we're not necessarily talking about gossip papers in the way we were in the 18th century, but we are talking about gossip, either verbal or through proper printed media.
So basically the Victorians ruined everything.
But gossip comes back.
But gossip does come back. The Victorians are like, we're not gonna gossip, but like we can gossip secretly. And you're gonna pretend that you don't realise we're talking about sex.
Yeah.
So many Victorians had nipple piercings, guys. So basically, what we've concluded from this episode is that gossip papers, Lady Whistledown, if we go back to her, not an anomaly. Really, like, she wasn't the first. She definitely wasn't the last. No. I mean, I do want to clarify here again that Lady Whistledown didn't exist.
Julie Andrews was not writing gossip in the long 18th century. If only.
If only. But people were writing gossip, and Lady Whistledown is I think what she's meant to be and what Bridgerton kind of tries to create is this almost like catch-all of scandal papers and gossip papers, right?
Yeah. And I also think what it's fundamentally trying to do is capture the social influence that gossip papers had at this time. And it is certainly a dramatized version of that. But that ripple effect you see in Whistledown of a society paper being published with a certain piece of gossip that then has these domino effects across society is certainly something you see real historical precedent for.
But I think the other thing that Bridgerton focuses on and really kind of gives attention to is the emergence of celebrity. And I think we talked about this a lot at the start of the episode very explicitly, and maybe it hasn't been so clear in the rest of the episode, but crucially, this is all about celebrity. This is all about an obsession with a parasocial relationship with people that you don't know.
And more than that, a parasocial relationship with certain ways of living and being. This is where you get the idea, the beginnings really, of this capitalist ideal that you are striving for, whether that is realistic for you or not.
Absolutely.
And gossip papers really feed and drive that obsession with finding yourself in that next step up in society in a lot of ways.
And with that, the kind of popular invention of the celebrity and the kind of massive popularization and accessibility of printing, you have the invention almost of celebrity gossip, of kind of on-the-fly scandal reporting and viral stories. Okay, maybe they're not viral like Timothée Chalamet's latest drama, but the point is that none of these are like modern inventions, are they? Like media culture, I think we think of media culture as a very modern thing, and it is to a certain extent in the way that it exists now, obviously. Like, they didn't have a podcast in 1811.
But they were gossiping, and even before that, particularly among elite literate circles, if you're looking at the early modern period, we see early forms of these gossip columns. Of course, not at all in the same way, but I'm thinking about particularly in Tudor courts, there were books of poetry that were passed around, and they were basically love notes, public love notes, that were being passed from person to person. And it was quite easy, if you had the socio-cultural knowledge of a court in the time, to figure out who was writing that poem and who that poem was about, right? That fundamentally is really an early form of gossip.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting the way you can sort of track this development across time. Both of this feminized version of oral gossip that I think we still see an incredible amount of judgment towards today. And
that feels very, I think oral gossip in particular feels very feminine.
Very feminine. And we can track this back, right? There have been some great pieces by particularly early modern women's historians who talk about, I think it's Laura Gower in particular, potentially, who's written some really interesting pieces on female gossip and the place of gossip in the lives of early modern women, in the marketplace, on the front stoop. That is the primary form of communication for women for centuries, because they don't have access into the print world. They don't have literacy. Those oral forms of gossip and storytelling are so important to the female oral and literary traditions.
Absolutely.
In my opinion, and I think to undercut and undersell them today really does a disservice to the very, very important role that gossip has played in women's history. That's my TED Talk, thank you. I had this argument with my father 2 weeks ago. What is your favorite instance that you can think of now of historical gossip and its impact?
So this is fascinating because I study such a random range sometimes, because I'm a queer historian, but I'm also an early modernist. So my PhD is obviously on the 17th century, but a lot of queer history and a lot of the kind of comparative points that I'm looking at are actually later 18th century and 20th century even. So, two options. Firstly, just the general gossip, drama, scandal surrounding Barbara Palmer in the 1660s. In one particularly wonderful publication, she's accused, which I think is actually true, but she's accused of threatening to bash her baby's heads against the mantelpiece.
I've read this piece.
Charles doesn't acknowledge the baby, right, as his. And he does, because he's like, whoa, you're fucking insane, don't do that.
Hold on.
He then proceeds to have 2 more children with her, mind you. So that one, just generally, she's just nuts, right? I think, other than that, generally any sort of scandal and libel and general gossip around Sarah Bernhardt and kind of gossip around late 19th and early 20th century French salon culture. That's not very specific, but like we have got an episode about Sarah Bernhardt lined up. We're not even doing this intentionally, guys. But Sarah Bernhardt she was an actress. She was probably bisexual.
Yeah.
She did have a relationship with a man through which she had a son. But she also had very famously like publicized relationships with women. But she also ran a salon in Paris, a salon of the same sort that we discussed earlier in terms of women and gossip, and basically these were meeting places for women, right? And in Sarah Bernhardt's salons they would like meet up and like perform plays and like perform Greek tragedies through which like 2 women would play, like for example like Odysseus and Penelope, or what's his name, Orpheus and Eurydice. It would always end tragically because it was Greek, obviously. But they would play them out as effectively like lesbian, sapphic love stories. And so much was written about her in such a way where it was like, there's never enough proof that it could actually have an effect. But everyone was aware, but everyone still like, they either loved her or they loved to hate her. So I think she is such a fascinating example of how that sort of kind of publication, scandal sheet, etc. creates an idea of celebrity more than it like that's what it is. Like you're creating an idea of a person. Yeah. Pretty much every single time except for in cases where they're like an influencer and they're completely in charge of their image, but even then they're presenting a version of themselves, right?
Yeah. And this leads me, so I have 2 examples from very different time periods. One of my first is I obsessed with the rumour mill that it surrounded Elizabeth I and her marriages, her favourites. There was such a deep-seated obsession, fear, both amongst the political elite. Yes.
Do you have a favourite?
Walter Raleigh.
Yeah.
I love Sir Walter Raleigh. The fact that she calls him my little pug.
Mine is Robert Devereux, because I think he's so stupid.
Fuck off!
No, just because I think he's so stupid.
Yeah. At least say Robert Dudley. Fuck off! The Earl of Essex? Are you serious?
Yeah, because he's so stupid. If he just shut the fuck up for 2 more years, he would have been like sorted, like sold for life. But he decided in 1601
go to the wrong Shakespeare play. That's literally what sparked all of the bullshit. You went to the wrong Shakespeare play. And that's the great thing about gossip with Elizabeth and her favourites. All you had to hear was that the Queen gave a private performance for so-and-so, and the rumour mill went wide that they were courting. She had such power in her singledom in so many ways. Don't get me wrong, an incredible amount of risk is tied up in that as well. But she used that gossip mill to her advantage in such a fascinating way to both bind people to her politically, but also to play the game of foreign politics at a time in a way that most people couldn't, just on the distinction of her gender. And that's why I think when historians today want to talk about Elizabeth devoid of gender, it's such a silly conversation to have, because she fundamentally weaponized that alongside the rumor and gossip mill in her political strategy, and I find that absolutely fascinating.
Definitely.
A similar regard, hundreds and hundreds of years later, the Kennedys. And I think it's because I'm watching An American Love Story right now.
I was going to say, are you watching Love Story right now?
I'm watching An American Love Story right now.
Is it Disney?
Disney, yeah.
This Disney show, which, if I'm correct, looks at JFK's son and his wife Carolyn.
Yeah, I mean, really fascinating. This sort of episode in history is quite fascinating, I think, as well, in Kennedy's history. And I highly recommend for people who are particularly interested in sort of a commentary around this. There is a historian, I can't quite remember her name right now, but I'll text it to Abby so she can put it in the show notes. But she basically was a historian covering the story of John and Carolyn as it happened. almost the idea of a royal biographer today. This is sort of our closest equivalent.
Okay.
She was an active biographer of John and Caroline during their lives. She has quite an interesting take on the John and Caroline story of capturing a lot of the American psyche in that moment of time, but not necessarily the truth of that story.
Okay.
And that's very much how I have watched the show. And I will admit that I am no expert on John and Caroline's story. I know much more about JFK and Jackie than I do about her. I know much more about Carolyn Kennedy than I do about John, to be completely honest with you.
I mean, all of their names seem to be John, so...
But I think what's interesting to me, and what this historian really made a point of, is there's such a public obsession and fascination with John and Caroline. And so much of that was driven by gossip columns, popular gossip papers at the time, particularly things like People magazine. This is really the sort of late 90s, is really the onset of People magazine as a concept, and these big publications that we see today publishing our gossip. And
People magazine and OK and Hello.
Yeah. Even the teeny bopper versions really start to sort of emerge in this time, and a lot of them were writing about John and Caroline. This really was one of the it couples of the time. And they really fed, similar to JFK, this idea of what a Kennedy should be. And I think that's one of the issues in their relationship, was Caroline was constantly measured against that, and particularly against Jackie. And that creates a lot of difficulties. We can see this today to sort of draw an equivalent to British media. You can look at the royal family and the different media and gossip reception of Kate to Meghan.
But also Kate and Meghan to Diana.
Yeah.
The fact that because Diana died so tragically and so young, she's always in this perpetual... She will forever be in this point of idolisation and heroism in a way that Meghan and Catherine have no hope of ever achieving.
And I think that really speaks to the role of gossip, both sort of across history, really. Gossip plays a very big role in setting and policing our moral norms. Gossip is going to constantly be filtered through the lens of our moral norms. The way that we're writing about instances like sex, right, change distinctly between that Georgian, Regency, and Victorian period, because social mores are changing across those periods. Those processes, I would say, are dialectic. They're fundamentally interconnected. One is always going to feed the other.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we see today as well. Gossip is both a reflection of and creating our moral landscape.
So in this episode, we have established that Lady Whistledown was not real, Bridgerton is a historical fantasy, and Queen Charlotte might have had some black heritage, but also that without gossip papers, we wouldn't have had the murder of JFK.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. As always, this has been HERstoryPod. HERstoryPod?
The HERstoryPod. By the HERstory Project.
Thank you. I've been Jillian Ducker.
I've been Abby Woodman.
Thank you so much for listening. We will be back next week or the week after with an episode with our researcher, Bex, about her PhD, because she is a doctor now. We should be calling her Dr. Rebecca Gadd, and only that. This episode was researched by our brand new research assistant, Layla Godala Gom, and assisted by Rebecca Gadd.
Dr. Rebecca Gadd.
Yeah. Hosted by Abby Woodman and Jillian Ducker, and edited by Caitlin Paul. Thank you so much for listening again, and we will see you next time.